What's up, everybody? Big Herc 916 getting down with Fresh Out. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share the channel. Let's blow this thing up. I'm here with my homie Chico. Very interesting man, has a lot of colorful stories I want to share with you guys. You know, I'm always bringing somebody different to the channel, and I'm very excited to sit down and have a conversation with my brother here today. Chico, you know, I know we've talked a lot off camera, but with your family's background in music and entertainment, what could you share as far as what you know about, like, as far as people looking to get into like the music industry and how that kind of plays out with, you know, knowing how publishing works and royalty works and stuff like that? Because we were just talking about how some of these people can literally live off of somebody else's royalties without ever having even performed on an album.
Certainly. I mean, I think that's a good point. You know, royalties are kind of the gift that keeps on giving, you know, so everybody goes for publishing. They want to make sure that, you know, that there's some residual component to it. I think the biggest piece of the record business is in my experience, you know, so obviously my parents were both in the record business. For a minute, we did music promotion, and then I was involved in music publishing for some years before I got into real estate. And the biggest piece is people to know the business. The problem is the business is often an afterthought, you know, and you know, my mother would actually say, making music is an art, but recording music is a business. The minute you've recorded and made a composition, now you're in a complete different world. And the big pitfall that we see that stems a lot of the, it'll spark a lot of the backlash and the outrage and the comments about record deals, record companies, to me really comes down to how well their business was handled in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I think the best bit of information to take away from that is it's not always you got a bad deal. You got the deal you could get, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if you could have done it by yourself, you wouldn't have gone to a record label in the first place, mm-hmm. right? So the reality of it is that if you're going to go into someone else's arena, you really got to know what you're doing, or you have to have people on your side who know what you're doing to cut those deals for you, to negotiate on your behalf, and just make sure you're well represented. Mm-hmm.
Now, put as far as in perspective of how much money is really being made, because I was just watching something on another channel, and the guy from Third Base, MC Serge, was talking about how he had did a deal for Nas, and he made Nas a millionaire, but I think his percentage was only like maybe 3% or 4%, but he was able to live off that for like 20 years.
Yeah.
So people don't know, like, as far as like how much money is really being generated with these songs that are being, like, you know, played on these different platforms, because, you know, you can hear a song in a commercial, you can hear it during a sporting event, you might hear it in a club or in a hotel.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing about having a record that really, really catches on is there is a big difference between the mechanical royalties that people receive versus something like synchronization royalties, right? When something's played in a movie versus just on the radio or through satellite radio, it's a very different level of royalty there. I think the hard part for the average artist is probably getting that kind of record that catches on or breaks through to the point where it can be applied to things like film. You know, so I think it's the reality of it is you want to make sure that when you're cutting those deals, that you understand that there's all these different ways to profit. So you'll hear people sometimes say, they call it different things now, but sometimes I know they used to refer to it almost as a finder's fee, right? Where people would get this 3% of it for the purposes of this deal, or almost for the duration of their performance career, right? They might get this very small percentage as a royalty for basically putting them on. And that's, when you think about it, I mean, you know, if over the course of a lifetime, if let's say somebody actually generated on their end $100 million over the course of their lifetime. Now, they've got to pay that fee, they got to pay management, attorneys, taxes. But let's say you got $3 million over 10 years, you know what I mean? that's not a bad scenario.
Yeah,
You basically made 300 grand over 10 years, 150 grand over 20 years, passive income, right? So I think the key is like standard records, like, it's hard. Everybody wants that Mariah Carey kind of, all I have to do for Christmas, all I ever want for Christmas record, or you want that record that's played in the stores, that's played on the commercials. But there's very, very few of those, So I think the average artist is going to be looking at traditional royalty splits from radio, satellite, maybe some samples in video games, which are very lucrative today.
Oh, that's right, video games.
Yeah, that's a big piece. But I'll just tell you over the years when I've come across friends and sometimes even clients that have had deals that involve recording, a lot of them tend to be a little more savvy than the average person, obviously, because they've come to people, they have attorneys, they've come to people who know more than them to make sure that they're being covered. But there have been agreements where it will completely kind of leave out elements of film, television. So they might have signed a particular type of deal and they get X amount of dollars, and then it's getting played on television. They wonder why they're not getting a check, right? And sometimes it's not always that somebody's stealing the money, it's that the money was never notated in the agreement, or it wasn't necessarily accounted for, and so it's there. But if you never go to claim it after a few years,
you know what?
It reverts.
It's funny you said that, because I was just listening to somebody, and I can't remember if it was Chameleonaire or Slim Thug, and he was saying like they were doing some type of weird accounting, and then when they went back and did the audit, like, hey man, you owe me like 150 or 300,000 for this and that. So once you can figure that out, which they don't tell you, they're like, oh, you got me,
Well, that's interesting. Like sometimes I'll go into like the UMG portal for Universal Music Group, and you can see kind of where royalties came from, or if you have an account with Sound Exchange, right? They would track like satellite streaming, those types of formats, because for many years that wasn't even an option, right? So I think it was about 2001, Sound Exchange, and I could have the year wrong, is calculating those royalties. But that's the weird thing is, how do you reconcile that, right? Like, I don't know. There's no way for me to really validate if streaming numbers are real, Oftentimes I'll go on YouTube and it'll be somebody I never heard of, and I'm like, apparently 1 billion views late. Apparently 1 billion other people watched the video before I did. And I'm like, wow. I mean, and don't get me wrong, some artists around the world are that big, but some people, you got to kind of wonder a little bit about the math. In my experience, I've kind of doubted that sometimes. But it's difficult because from a reconciliation perspective, if you wanted to dispute that, how would you? How do you argue with somebody over how many times something's streamed or what the accounting is like on the other end? It's difficult.
Now, when your mom managed MC Hammer, and like before social media and stuff, I mean, dude, he was hitting every whatever platform was out. He was like the biggest thing out there. I mean, putting that in perspective, what type of, like, in today's day and age, what would that be comparable to? Because I mean, those numbers were, he was everywhere.
It's difficult because, so my mother was the vice president of his record label, which was Busted Records, that he had through Capitol Records. It's difficult by today's standards because a lot of times the types of money that people are arguing about today, he was already getting 30 years ago. You know what I mean? A lot of people, the numbers they're really, and I'm talking about an actually received.
30 years ago? When
you think about like the amount of, the kind of like liquidity and cash flow, and remember, this is when people weren't necessarily cutting 360 deals and cutting half of their show money in half with the label. And so when you think about the volume of radio airplay at the time, right now we've got all these options to stream music, but it's difficult by today's numbers, right? Because I mean, at one point you're talking about, Can't Touch This was one of the biggest records around. But that's an interesting point about MC Hammer because I tell people as a kid, I firmly remember, my mother would bring home all of this different stuff. And I mean, it was, now this is back when, now today, getting an endorsement deal is the name of the game, right? Mm-hmm. But this was when that was being a sellout, right? You got a sneaker deal from British.
Oh, that was a sellout?
Yeah, like people would be like, oh my God, like I can't believe you did a Pepsi commercial, or you did a KFC commercial, or you got British Nights, or you have a cartoon, or you have a board game, or he had all of this stuff, right? I have the action figure somewhere around here.
Wow.
So in today's world, at the time, those were huge business accomplishments in reference to cutting these types of deals and partnerships for the purposes of branding. I've always said, kind of jokingly when I'm talking to other people, that are still heavily in the music business, I always kind of say that if you ever kind of wanted to know a good blueprint on business, it would have been those who handled MC Hammer's business, like my mother and his brother is a very sharp guy, Louis Burrell. My mother, Linda McCall, Linda Lou was very, very instrumental in cutting a lot of these deals. And then you would flash forward to somebody like Master P, right? Master P is basically telling you all the things you need to do when the distribution deal was the name of the game, how to create some leverage, how to have a product, how to sell that product before you go to a label, right? Because if you go to them after, of course it's all their money. It's all their risk, right? You didn't come with anything, you brought a demo. Yeah. But if you came with a track record, it would be a very, very different turnout when it comes to your deal. And then flashing forward to even somebody like Soulja Boy. What's funny is people don't give Soulja Boy a lot of credit. But before people were really on anything digital, it was Soulja Boy, right? And he's basically telling you these are the ways to have leverage with a big company or usurp a big company. And it's like people have an insatiable desire to go right back in and cut deals that they ultimately later complain about. But some of these artists from back in the day, I think, were huge. I mean, when you're talking about making $30 million in a year, Hammer did that at one point, early 90s, right? Think about today. I mean, you hear people say that, but I mean, now people throw around $100 million like it's like it's just pennies. It's used so loosely. And when you think about the reach of some of these artists, you got to kind of wonder, are you really making that kind of money? To put that into perspective, if you think about Michael Jackson, right? Michael Jackson's one of these people that his music translates language barriers. Yes. Right? So you could see a kid during Desert Storm 25 years ago doing a Michael Jackson dance for soldiers in a country where they don't even readily learn about Jesus Christ.
That's right, yeah.
That gives you some perspective on the sheer magnitude of somebody before the internet, right? Now people have the internet and they're popular, but there's a lot of them, right? So you got to kind of wonder, when you hear people talking about the kinds of money that they're making, is that really true? Now, there are some guys that, to me, have handled business first, and oh my God, they do phenomenally well. They might not be the most popular people, but they're certainly the most successful when it comes to a monetary perspective. But that just comes down to how their business was handled.
So like with Hammer, he in a sense created a brand before he went to the label, or was he already?
Yeah, no.
Because I remember.
No, Hammer actually already had shows. He had a following.
Yeah.
One of the gentlemen from my dad's band, Confunction, was very instrumental in kind of getting him, started in his first major kind of record deal scenario, which is how my mother got pulled into the fold. But he didn't start off cold turkey. He wasn't like the guy who sent the demo to the record label and then somebody in the record company picked it up. You know what I mean? I mean, he already had something going. He and his family were already working on kind of his whole act, right? Which is something that you can sell, that lives in the hearts and the minds of people. Great talent, dance moves, good music. These types of things are a no-brainer to a company that's just trying to sell a product, basically. And I think that's what people forget. These companies they're selling a product. Now, whether or not people like the product or they think the product's the best for the world is a different story, but they're there to sell what people want.
Well, because he with the fashion, I mean, the baggy pants, the sweatsuits with the true, you know what I mean? I mean, they were imitating him. I remember Living Color, Can't Touch.
Yeah, they used to make fun. I mean, but that's how big he was. I think that's the interesting thing about today's world. I feel like technology moves so fast that people have a very short memory. And I don't think people realize the magnitude of what a superstar is. I think a lot of people are very popular. Of course, we've got some big names today, but I really don't think people really understand the magnitude of some people and how popular they were, for them to permeate shows, for them to permeate news cycles. It's almost like I was talking to a buddy of mine the other day out of New York, and we were on the phone, and we were talking about when Michael Jackson videos had release dates. and people would like line up to wait for the video to come on, like the black and white video, the black or white video. You know, I remember when this was like a thing. It had a premiere time.
Yeah.
You know, so it's no knock on anybody today, but I just feel like there's a there were people prior to, I think, celebrities today who I think many times had to have a very different level of talent to obtain the same amount of money.
Well, you said even, I mean, they had it popping over in London. I mean, I mean, it's like international before they had that type of, you know what I mean?
When you think about, and it's funny because I've always thought, I remember, you know, Wu-Tang Clan had a big following overseas. You know, my dad's band had a big following mostly in Japan, like was one of their big markets out of the US. International touring and tours in general. I think the difference in today and many years ago were these big tours that people just really felt like they had to see because, you know, you couldn't just open up your phone.
That's right.
And you couldn't see anything like that. So you really had to go on the tour. You really had to go there and experience it. So tours, I think, really required artists to become these world acts, right? If they wanted to go beyond the USA, they really had to put on these big world tours. And I mean, you really can't remember, particularly in the black music, how many big world tours that, you know, I kind of joke, I've been to a lot of concerts in the last 20 years, but I just feel like the Velvet Rope tour with Janet Jackson might have been like the last like mega tour that I really remember like as being this big deal. You know, Beyonce has big tours and you know, but I just feel like it's a different world with social media, you know, and I don't really think it's the fault of any artist. It's just the way we absorb information is people want to see pieces of the show before they commit, right? So they're chipping away at, I think, a little bit of that excitement that used to take place in person. And I think people like Hammer, who put on a great show, lots of dancers, theatrics, this whole thing, I think at one point was the norm for concerts, but you know, no knock. I love rap, so no knock on people that just stand at the edge of the stage and rap. But you know, it's kind of not the same thing. You know.
Do you think that you know, from now with this whole, you know, you go to other cities and they got like the whole, you got to check in with this dude and do this and that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it wasn't really any of that. I know it was a different era in hip hop, but how would you compare that, and what would you say as far as like with artists back then that were going like, you know, Hammer going to New York or going to Atlanta or going to Houston and places like that? I mean,
you know what? It's difficult because, like I said, I'm not terribly old, but we went to a lot of the shows, and I always remember that as primarily being a West Coast thing. You know, like, I mean, now you see people. I think when you see it because they have a very different culture there. They've got a very different culture in California because remember for many years a lot of the artists were East Coast artists trying to venture west.
Yeah.
You know, early years of rap, right? The early, predominantly first 10 popular years of rap was mostly East Coast artists, New York artists trying to venture into other markets. To go backwards, it's not so backwards compatible. Like, I mean, yeah, people have to do that depending on where they're going. Of course, in Chicago, there's areas where, yeah, you would have to check in probably if you someplace pretty risky or someplace you shouldn't be anyway, you know, whereas I don't know if it's as organized as maybe it used to be when people would go to California. You know, sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's extortion. You know, it's just kind of like, you know, and you got to wonder. It's like, are you protecting me from what might happen, or are you just agreeing to make sure you don't make anything happen? You know what I mean? Like, so sometimes it's you hear that, but you got to kind of wonder if it's always necessary. I almost feel like sometimes people feel like this level of validation. Sometimes if I, you know, if they're new to the business and they say, oh yeah, you know, whenever I go here, I check in. That's the respectful thing to do if you're going to be anywhere in a risky scenario. But sometimes I do wonder, like, you know, is that really something everybody has to do? Now, granted, if you're going to be anywhere around people saying that I don't need security stuff, I mean, that's just
you're talking out loud.
That's ridiculous. You know, I mean, nobody of any substance or means should be doing that. You know,
does anything jump out at you, like when you know, a story that you may have heard that you found kind of funny or interesting when you think about how hip hop was back then as compared to now? Like, you know, maybe, you know, a performance or a studio session, or.
You know what? It's funny. We spent a lot of time. Man, we met lots of people over the years, but it's difficult because I guess by today's standards, there's a lot of behavior that I guess people would say was, oh, that's crazy, or, man, we spent so much time just kind of, my parents took us everywhere. We used to go to, I remember being kids and we would go to like Def Comedy Jam and we'd be like the only kids there, It's different because you're around it so much that I guess what people would think, whether it's any sort of crazy behavior or crazy expenses, some of the extravagant things people would buy or do, seems so normal. And, there's probably not a whole lot that I could necessarily share.
Yeah.
But nothing really outrageous,
Okay.
nothing really outrageous. I feel like a lot of times what happens is a lot of the stories that people have are very true, but then sometimes I feel like for the purposes of shock value, there's a lot of, because remember, for the difference in today versus many years ago is I feel like if you have people who are really, whether they're musicians, right? So my dad being a drummer, a lot of the guys he hung out with were other musicians, right? Musicians are in the studio and they're working. There's not a whole lot of so
it wasn't a whole now you have musicians with Hollywood, with athletes.
Yeah, like back, my dad knew a lot of people, but it's funny. I remember being around other musicians and other drummers from big bands, and they would be talking shop about drummer stuff. But when they're in the studios or when you would spend time around some artists that are true musicians, the studio sessions are very different, right? So if you even have the ability to be present or be there, which I think we were probably the only kids that were kind of schlepped around to everything, people were working. Now I feel like in the studio sessions I've been in, the things I've been a part of, it's a little more of a social environment, right? Okay. But I think that's a lot of the music too, right? If you're creating the vibe for music, you're kind of creating this vibe in a recording studio, which you did many years ago, but it might be candles and a piano and champagne, or they might be smoking weed, but they're kind of setting the mood when they're doing these compositions. Mm-hmm. I think today they do the same thing. I just feel like when I go to stuff, it's a little less organized for some artists. Mm-hmm. Now, some producers you'll see when they're in there, they're dialed in.
They're in the zone.
They're dialed in. They're working. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the difference between maybe a lot of the R&B artists or the bands that we saw growing up versus rappers today, right? I think some of the young rappers, they think it's... So to give you an example, I used to have a recording studio. And it was more of a private studio. We dealt with some artists. Some artists kind of that went on to be pretty popular. And it was mostly publishing stuff. So this is where you would record things, and they may or may not be placed on other people's albums, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people like to put their name on them, so you don't really run down the list of, oh, I did this or I did that. You got paid to not say that. And a lot of times when you do music publishing. But me and a gentleman who was a great mentor to me had this little recording studio. And I remember it was in right off Memorial Drive, kind of in the Stone Mountain, Decatur area of Atlanta. And you realize when people come in, a lot of them, some people come in to work, and some of them, they come in and they bring the entourage and they bring the weed and they want to try to spill liquor damn near on your equipment. And they think this is a complete normal part of recording. Mm-hmm. And like I said, recording is a business. Making music and freestyling in your buddy's car, that's an art form. You can go do that all day. Yeah. You can smoke all the weed, you can spill all the liquor you want. But when it comes time to record, that's the business side of it. And I think that's the part that needs to be taken more serious. And I feel like at one point was. Another part to that is I think some of the craziness that you see, that I've seen in some of the studios. It's different when you're in a smaller pre-production studio or in today's world where equipment is readily accessible. But I don't think it was, growing up, I remember going to these studios with these huge SSL boards and these big, extremely expensive analog recording boards, multi-track boards, where it would have been completely unusual to be in there, splashing champagne because people are working. You got engineers, you've got producers. Most of the time, people are sitting around, and I think there's a lot of very professional people today. But that tone is typically set by the producer or the engineer. So nothing crazy. I think for a lot of the stuff we were around, it was all business. Okay. Especially if we were around, because remember I was young, right? So when my mother took us around, they didn't really play around a lot. It was anybody they were dealing with. It was business first. Kind of fun and fame second. Yeah. So. Hey, there you guys have it.
Big Herc 916 getting down with Chico on Fresh Out. Stop walking around with a crusty butt, smelly ball sack, and a funky hoo-ha. Big Herc said, wash that ass. Pick you up a t-shirt at freshoutseries.com.